that if you don't believe that God ordains everything that comes to pass, bottom line, you don't believe in God.
In other words, if you're not a Calvinist, you don't believe in God.
The Calvinists will say that that God, if God allows certain things to occur in the universe that he did not decree or that he did not determine, then God is no longer sovereign. But he's not, because God must be sovereign over all things. And so if God, and this is a mistake that John Calvin made. I'll take my glasses off here for a second, because John Calvin said that if anything is permitted to occur in the universe that was not directly determined by God's will, then the universe moves at random, and that things are left to fortune. And Calvin could not emotionally cope with the possibility that anything in the universe could move at random or could be left to fortune. Because if that's the case, there are some things that God does not have control over, and he falls apart. If that's the case, Calvin loses his mind, and he has a nervous breakdown. And the whole thing is rooted in a faulty definition of sovereignty. For the Calvinists and for John Calvin, God's sovereignty is his causality over all of creation. And I think that's a faulty, and I think it's an unfortunate definition of God's sovereignty, and it leads to all sorts of problems that are ultimately unresolvable. And I would argue that the proper definition of God's sovereignty is lordship over free creatures, that God is the authority, the ultimate authority of the universe. He's the moral authority of the universe. The universe is obligated to do his will, but God's not going to cause the universe to do his will. He's going to cause some of what he has created to do his will and bidding, but he's not going to cause the what I would call the libertarian free choices, but he's not going to cause the choices of human beings that he has created. But he has ultimate authority over all those choices, and we will answer to him for all those choices. That's what sovereignty means. Is that all of creation will answer to God ultimately. And
what better way to steelman a Calvinist than to let a leading Calvinist make this exact point? Many of you are familiar with R.C. Sproul. He's gone on to be with the Lord now, but he's got very well known for the whole no maverick molecule kind of argument. And so I want you to hear it for yourself here in this clip, and then we'll kind of engage with it. I don't think we'll listen to the whole 6 minutes here, but I just want you to hear it for yourself, this argument from an actual Calvinist. Listen.
When I was teaching seminary, I was responsible to teach a course on the theology of the Westminster Confession of Faith. The Westminster Confession of Faith is a 17th century theological document that was the confessional foundation for historic Presbyterianism. And we'd come to the place in the confession where I was going to have to teach chapter 3 the following week. And chapter 3 is entitled On the Eternal Decrees of God. Now, among Presbyterians, they know exactly what that means. They said, uh-oh, now we're going to talk about predestination. And when you get a bunch of seminary students together, and there's nothing they enjoy better than to chew over questions about predestination into endless discussions into the night. They love it, and they love to debate that topic. So I said, next Tuesday night, we're going to take up chapter 3 of the confession. I have to understand that this particular class was open to the public. And so people who were not enrolled as seminary students were allowed to come in and audit the class or drop by to visit a particular lecture. So every one of my students, who had a friend who didn't believe in predestination, they went out and cornered them and grabbed them by the throat and said, you got to come here, our professor, and he's going to play paladin, have gun, will travel. He's going to teach us all about predestination. So we had about 250 students assembled, I guess, that night in the class. And I started the class by reading the opening lines of chapter 3 of the Westminster Confession. I don't have them down verbatim, but I can give you basically what it says there. It starts off by saying something like this. that God has, or does, from all eternity, immutably and sovereignly ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Comma.
Now, I know you're very familiar with that, Phil, and that's kind of the statement of what you're talking about, that he sovereignly ordains whatsoever comes to pass. That's that same comment from John Calvin, saying that God is the cause of all things that are. And that's really the only logical, rational conclusion you can come to if you believe in an omniscient, all-knowing, all-powerful creator. He has to be, in essence, the cause of all things that come to pass. And so that's what he's reading from the Westminster there. Do you want to add anything to that before we go on?
No. Whenever I read that, no, except that. Whenever I read that, I just think John Calvin may have just written the Westminster Confession, because it is, you can see John Calvin in the Westminster Confession like ribs on a skinny man. It's almost as though they didn't have cut and paste at that point, but it's almost as if they just cut and paste things right out of the eternal decrees of God, on the eternal ordination of God, or what, I can't remember what the name of the book is that Calvin wrote, because that's another book that I draw heavily from. But that is exactly what Calvin said, and so Sproul echoes what Calvin is saying there, and he's taking Calvin literally, which I think every Calvinist should, and I think we should. But I just want to say real quick, just kind of as a little teaser, that if God ordains, and John Calvin said causes, he didn't just say ordain, he said causes, because for Calvin, to ordain and to cause are indistinguishable from one another.
Right.
And I explore that idea in the book, into why that is. But if that's true, then that means that God ordains and causes and predestines all things about humanity. That includes our thoughts, our beliefs, our judgments, our evaluations, and our reasoning. So all of our mental processes are also determined immutably by God. And I'm glad that Sproul brought up, the word immutably, that all of our thoughts are immutably determined by God, period.
Yep.
And so let's just put that in our back pocket for a second, and then go ahead and go on.
So again, God does sovereignly, immutably ordain whatsoever comes to pass, comma. I stopped right there at the comma, and I said, now here's this statement. It says that from all eternity, God does freely and sovereignly and immutably ordain every single thing that comes to pass. How many of you believe that? I mean, this was a Presbyterian seminary, and 200 hands went up in the air, proudly wearing the badge of their conviction of the sovereignty. Go, well, we believe that. 50 hands didn't go up. I said, okay, how many of you don't believe it? I said, it's okay, nobody's taking down names, and you're not going to get any trouble. We're not going to have a heresy trial here, or get out the matches, burn you at the stake. I said, let's be honest, how many of you don't believe that? About 50 guys raised their hand. We don't believe that. I said, okay. Let me ask another question. How many of you would candidly describe yourselves as atheists? Again, no persecution going to be taking place here. How many of you would call yourself atheists? Nobody put up their hand. And I immediately went into my Lieutenant Columbo routine, There's just one thing I don't understand here.
Columbo.
And I said, I don't understand why those of you who did say that you did not believe in this statement didn't raise your hand when I asked you if you were atheists. Well, I mean, there was a hue and cry. I was ready to be lynched. I said, what are you talking about? Just because we don't believe that God freely and immutably ordains whatsoever comes to pass, you're calling us atheists? I said, that's exactly what I'm calling you. I said, if you don't believe that God ordains everything that comes to pass, bottom line, you don't believe in God.
In other words, if you're not a Calvinist, you don't believe in God.
And
Isn't that basically what he just said?
Yeah, and if you don't believe in Calvin's definition of sovereignty, you don't believe in God. Because that's his definition of basically his definition of sovereignty is that he ordains and causes immutably everything that comes to pass.
And this is the kind of statement that has been said and repeated and quoted in memes and other things by Calvinists for decades. Because this was years ago that he even recorded this. And then sometimes we're accused of being the ones who are being too harsh towards Calvinists in some of the claims and statements that we say. And most of the time, we're not even getting close to the kinds of things that their leading scholars are saying. Now, of course, you can find any internet non-Calvinist or Calvinist out there that'll say all kinds of grotesque things about the other side. But we're talking about a leading scholar in the field saying that Arminians are saved, but just barely. And saying things like, if you don't believe in this concept and idea of God, then you don't believe in God at all. You might as well call yourself an atheist. I can't imagine that I've ever said anything that bold with regard to the alternative side. In other words, I've never come out and said, James White, you don't believe in the provisionist idea and understanding of God's love and provision for all people, then you don't believe in God at all. They would be playing that over and over and over again. Matter of fact, there's probably some of them going to clip that little section out and pretend like I did say it. Yeah. Because that's the kind of thing that you see happening on Twitter, unfortunately, by some of the folks in that crowd. Not all of them, obviously. I'm not accusing James White himself of that or whatever, but it's frustrating. If nothing else.
I would give Sproul a pass here if he would say, you don't believe in my concept of God. And I believe my concept of God comes from Scripture. And so it makes me wonder if you really do believe in God, because I think my concept of God is the right one.
And maybe he softens it later. Maybe in this video he softens it. Yeah, we'll give him a chance here. Maybe he softens it.
Yeah,
we'll see.
Could be. I don't know.
You don't believe in God. So you have to understand that.
I'm sorry. I was going to go ahead and keep going. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
All right.
Passage here in the confession that God ordains everything that comes to pass. There's not anything in that statement that is uniquely Presbyterian. There's not even anything in there that's uniquely Christian. That statement doesn't divide Presbyterians from Methodists or Lutherans or Anglicans, and it doesn't distinguish between Presbyterians and Islamic religion or Judaism religion. It's a distinction between theism and atheism. It's a statement, simply a declaration of the absolute sovereignty of God.
There it is.
When I try to get these young people...
Yeah. And the thing is even in my talk with CJ yesterday, and he had read that portion of the scriptures, I said, if you define ordain or decree in a way some of my Molinist friends do, like William Lane Craig and maybe Stratton and others, you could probably sign off on aspects of that statement, because how does God ordain? It's almost like the statement from Tozer, which I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect of God has, in his sovereignty, has not ordained which choice you'll make, but that you'll be free to make it. Therefore, when you make a free choice, you're not countervailing the sovereign will of God, but you're fulfilling it insofar as that he gave you a choice to make. And so by making a free choice, you're doing his sovereign will. And in that sense, you could say, yes, God has ordained all things that come to pass, which would include the fact that I get to make free choices. That's a part of his ordained will. And so you can make that's part of the problem with some of these statements, because you can, by defining terms like free will differently, that's why we have to keep saying libertarian free will versus compatibilistic free will, and we define sovereignty this way versus deterministically, or whatever else that it comes down to defining of terms. But just to be clear, he has already said what he means by this verse would not fit Tim Stratton's or William Lane Craig's definition of these terms. He is ultimately saying, if you don't believe the Calvinistic understanding of sovereignty, then you're not affirming that God is God.
Right. And the word ordain must mean determine. As far as the concept of sovereignty that Sproul has and that John Calvin has. And that's why I argue in the book that there's that the word ordain and cause are indistinguishable from one another. And John Calvin was completely committed to God's causality. Now, there are some Calvinists who will retreat from God's causality and say that God decrees all things, but doesn't necessarily cause all things. And our dear friend Chris Dade is one of the ones who will make that distinction. And I discussed that at length in the book about what the retreat from causality implies and where that leads. And I believe that it leads to a dead end. But Tim Stratton and I had long conversations before writing this book, because, like I said, he was the one that urged me to write this book. You can hear Tim's voice in this book. You can definitely hear his voices because he's had a huge influence on me. But what I did was I read John Calvin in my early 20s when I was trying to confront and cope with these soteriological issues. But I read John Calvin again recently as I was writing this book. I studied and did my research for this book by reading the Institutes again, and it was as if I had read a whole new book in a whole new way and understood something that I had never understood before, because I was approaching it from a purely soteriological perspective in my early 20s, and this time when I read Calvin, I started realizing that he was really all about determinism, and that his soteriological principles were derived from his determinism. It wasn't the other way around. But there's so much that I have to say about compatibilism, and free will and God's guilt and that kind of thing. I hope we can have time to get to it. But
and we can definitely do that. For those that don't know, we're talking about his book Calvin's Desperation, how John Calvin's unbiblical divine determinism destroys the credibility of the Christian faith. And even that byline really kind of highlights, I think, the motivation for me doing this broadcast and the motivation for you writing the book is the way in which Calvinism's claims are often used by atheists and unbelievers and others, because as an evangelist, director of evangelism and apologetics for Texas Baptist, I run into this more often than maybe the average bear, because Bair, not Phil, Bair, but I run into it quite a bit in the apologetic world, where it's the credibility of Christianity is being questioned based on the basis of what Calvinists claim Christianity is, and not on the basis of the kind of Christianity that you and I would teach. And that's for no other reason, if for no other reason, that these errors should be called out, as even if only offered as defeaters for the atheists who are using the Calvinistic claims as their weapon, weaponizing the Calvinistic claims of Christianity in order to discredit us and our credibility. If nothing else, we should have good apologetic arguments from our side to be able to tell them why the Calvinistic version of the Christian faith is not the only version, nor even the most popular version throughout Christian history.
Right. Yeah. And I address Chris Date quite a bit in the book. I address Guillaume Bignon quite a bit in the book. I address James White quite a bit. And I would just say, if I can be so bold, I would say that the atheists have valid points when they point to the Calvinistic God and say, I don't want to believe in a God like that. I'm not going to believe in a God who determines all things and who is actually going to cause human beings to do horrible, horrific things like murder the Messiah, and pretty much any sin that is committed by a human being. The atheist is going to point to the Calvinist framework and say, every atrocity that mankind commits in terms of moral atrocity, that's God's doing. God is the perpetrator of that atrocity, because God immutably determined that man would commit those atrocities. If that's the case, then we can't see how God can remain innocent, can remain a morally perfect being, and still cause those atrocities to occur. Now, the indeterminists can say God permitted those atrocities because he has given mankind libertarian free will. And so therefore, God is not guilty of those things. And one of the things that I point out in the book strongly is that the reason that I and so many others, my colleague Tim Stratton and you and so many others, are so focused on libertarian free will is that it's the only way that we can maintain the biblical principle that man is guilty of sin. Because if we have no libertarian free will, we are not guilty of sin. And that's the title of Guillaume Bignon's book. It's excusing sinners and blaming God. And ironically, that's exactly what Calvinism does, even though he's trying to argue against that.
Right.
But the other aspect of Calvinism, or of compatibilism, I've heard recently someone who said, and they were of the Calvinist persuasion, and they said that God's determining of all things and his innocence are compatible. And that was the way he defined compatibilism. But I've never heard compatibilism defined like that. The way that I've heard compatibilism defined is that God's determining of all things and human responsibility or human free will or some version of it are compatible.
Right. Yeah, that's how I've always heard it as well. But I did want to get through the rest of this. It's
Okay.
only a 6-minute clip, and there's only 2 minutes left of this, and I want to get it to where he gets into the rogue molecule thing here.
Okay.
Able to see was this, very simply, that if God is not sovereign, God is not God. If there is one maverick molecule in the universe, one molecule running loose outside the scope of God's sovereign ordination, then, ladies and gentlemen, there is not the slightest confidence that you can have that any promise that God has ever made about the future will come to pass.
Wow.
Thanks for
To me, that's such a broad, bold statement. It sounds like to me, from my perspective now, back when I was a Calvinist and heard a statement like that, I just amen it, and it sounds so pious and bold, God's sovereignty. But now I hear a statement like that, and it's almost like, kind of in a joking way, you see one of those little sugar ants in your kitchen, those little bitty sugar ants that everybody gets. And I see one little sugar ant there, and I see my son standing there. I go, squish that, ant. If there's one ant, one little sugar ant that I don't kill and I don't control perfectly and know exactly what's happening to it and what it's doing, then it's possible that this entire house will come crumbling down.
Or that you don't exist.
What? Or that you'll stop, or whatever. I mean, do you really think that little sugar ant has that much power, Dad? No, it doesn't have that much power. That's, you're not that worried about it, because it doesn't have more power to overcome this structure that we have built.
That's right.
A rogue molecule, much less a rogue demon, Satan himself, does not have enough power to overcome and destroy God's creation. And that's why they always hear about, Jonathan Pritchett talking about free will is not a superpower. It's not like giving somebody free will, i.e. rogue abilities, is not like we're saying that we now become superheroes that can destroy the universe, like we're Thanatos or something, we can destroy the universe now or something because we have free will.
Or overthrow God's intentions and overthrow God's accomplishments. Right. I heard a Twitter Calvinist recently say that if God doesn't control every single thing that occurs in the universe, then he cannot accomplish his purposes. And I was just kind of flabbergasted by that, because to think that God cannot accomplish his purposes even if man has libertarian free will, that's a pretty small view of God. That's not a very capable God, and in my view, that's not a God worth worshiping. But let me replace some terminology in R.C. Sproul's narrative there. He said, if there is one rogue molecule, then God is not sovereign. It's essentially what he's saying. Okay, so let's say if there is one rogue thought on the part of a human being, God is not sovereign, because it all falls into place. If one rogue molecule threatens God's sovereignty, then one rogue thought in my head also threatens God's sovereignty, and one rogue belief in my head threatens God's sovereignty. And so therefore, God has to determine immutably every thought, belief, and judgment in my brain, in my head, in my mind. Okay, whatever you want to say. That means that I did not arrive at any of my beliefs through a process of rational deliberation. And Tim Stratton talks a lot about rational responsibility and what determinism does through rational responsibility. It creates this epistemic meltdown, as he puts it. But he talks about a rational meltdown. I focus a little bit more on epistemology in my book. And I have a chapter called How Should I Know? And in that chapter, what I argue is that if God determines all things about humanity, if he immutably brings about and ordains, which means causes everything that comes to pass, that includes my thoughts, beliefs, and judgments. And if that's the case, I can't trust any of my thoughts or beliefs or judgments, because they're not placed there because they're true or false. They're placed there because God determined me to believe them. And the Calvinist might say, well, God is good, so he would not determine you to hold a false belief. And so you can trust all of your beliefs. Well, I can't trust all my beliefs because not all my beliefs are true. Sometimes I have false beliefs. And not only that, but the idea that God is good and would not put a false belief in my head deliberately and deterministically, how do I know that isn't an idea that God deterministically caused me to believe? And so I don't know whether that's true any more than I would know anything else is true.
Right.
And so what I argue in the book is that exhaustive divine determinism, just like all kinds of exhaustive determinism, lead to a complete breakdown in epistemology. Human knowledge is suddenly destroyed and is absolutely impossible. There's no way that we can know anything if all of our thoughts and beliefs and judgments are determined, because we don't know whether the God who is determining these things is trustworthy. And his trustworthiness may just be another idea that he put in my head. He might be deceiving me into thinking that he's trustworthy.
Well, and that's why I think Dr. Stratton refers to that version or understanding of God as a deity of deception, because basically what it would be is that God is ultimately the cause of my deceptions. Right. I'm not the cause of my own deceptions. So whoever deceived me is not really the ultimate cause of my own deceptions. God would be. And so therefore it makes God into a deity of deception, because even his own children hold to at least one false theological belief. And so that false theological belief had to have its origin not in the world or in any creature, but in the divine, in God. Right. And so that's I think a very strong argument from his side, is that libertarian free will has to exist to protect the holiness of God and the culpability of the creature. And so when we're defending these things, we're not trying to defend these things because we want all power and we want all this authority and we want people to worship us and we want to bow the altar of the almighty free will of man. We're doing this as a defense of God's character, his holiness, and man's culpability, man's responsibility. And so you can blame us for being wrong all you want, but don't impugn our motivations here. Our motive is not to try to get more credit for our salvation or to be praised and worshiped as the all-powerful free will, people of the world. No, our motivation is to make sure men are held accountable for what they do, right, and to make sure that God is not held accountable for things he doesn't do. Okay, that's our motivations, whether you like it or not, Calvinists. That's exactly what we're doing.